The most important reason for the economic crisis in Venezuela was the U.S. economic war and the sanctions, period. I mean, the Venezuelan government did commit some errors, which we can talk about, but the most important reason, that if you cannot understand anything without understanding the fact that Venezuela for 100 years has been a petrostate that has relied on exporting its oil. The U.S. put very heavy sanctions in Venezuela, leading to an economic embargo that prevented Venezuela from producing and exporting its oil, which the government relied on, and it faced a severe economic crisis. It's not because of socialism and all of that. In fact, in Venezuela, the vast majority of the economy has always remained private. But they did have a very progressive government that launched the Bolivarian Revolution that nationalized the oil industry in particular, which was very important. So Venezuela faces the economic problems that many resource-rich countries have faced, that economists often refer to as Dutch disease or the resource curse, right? There's this idea that having a lot of natural resources is something very good because your country can become wealthy. Well, yes and no. It can also be a curse because what happens is that a country that has a lot of natural resources often simply exports those natural resources and lives off the rent of the exports, but does not actually develop other industries. This is a problem that we've seen in many countries, Saudi Arabia as being the clear example, right? Where, in Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of the population does not even have citizenship. The majority of the population consists of migrant workers, largely from South Asia, Southeast Asia, who are treated horribly, basically like slaves. This is the same model in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain. So you have a small elite, like 5 to 10% of the population actually has citizenship, and they benefit from the natural resources, but the country basically relies on exploiting this foreign labor that's paid very low. Now, if you look in Venezuela, so Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years before Hugo Chavez, the revolutionary, was born. And then what happened is, for most of its history, that oil did not benefit the majority of the population. That oil benefited a small handful of elites, like in Saudi Arabia. And you can read, it's just disgusting. I've spent a lot of time in Venezuela, and you can read the books written by some of the former elites, like Vanessa Neumann, who was a daughter of one of the wealthiest Venezuelan oligarchs. And she was involved in this coup attempt with Juan Guaido, where the U.S. tried to appoint this fake president, Juan Guaido, who never participated in a presidential election. The Trump administration appointed him as the fake president of Venezuela and tried to pressure other countries to recognize him. Well, one of his so-called ambassadors to the UK was Vanessa Neumann, from one of the wealthiest families in the country. And she wrote a book in which she literally makes fun of people in the US for being poor compared to her lifestyle growing up before the Bolivarian Revolution. And she said that we were so rich that we would fly to Miami in the morning and go shopping and spend thousands of dollars and then fly back to Venezuela at night. She boasted about this in her book. So that's how Venezuela was until the Bolivarian Revolution. And then Hugo Chavez, who was also, speaking of left-wing military officers, he was a military officer from a very poor background, and he was influenced by the history of the left-wing movements in Latin America and also by liberation theology. And he originally tried a military coup against a brutal right-wing leader, Carlos Andrés Pérez, who carried out a massacre. There were protests against his neoliberal policies that were backed by the IMF, the Washington Consensus policies. And Carlos Andrés Pérez, this US-backed right-wing Venezuelan leader, he ordered a massacre of Venezuelan protesters. Thousands of civilians were killed and injured in what was known as the Caracazo. And some military officers, they were radicalized by this experience and they became revolutionaries. And Hugo Chavez tried to overthrow him and have a left-wing military takeover, and he failed. And then Chavez was imprisoned. And then he became such a popular figure in popular Venezuelan consciousness in the 90s that he was pardoned. And then he ran for president in 1998, and he won the election fair and square in 1999. And then Hugo Chavez launched the Bolivarian Revolution, named after Simón Bolívar, the leftist, the anti-colonial leader who fought against Spanish colonialism. and in the 18th and early 19th century. And Bolivar helped create the modern countries of Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia. That's why Bolivia is named after him, right? Ecuador. So anyway, so Chavez went back to this history of Bolivar. He created the Bolivarian Revolution, and he nationalized the oil industry that historically had been used to benefit the elites. Instead, he used that oil revenue to fund social programs. The Venezuelan government has built more than 5 million housing units for poor and working people that they provide at very low cost. I've seen some of the housing. I mean, it's, they're apartments. They're not like super luxury housing, but they're better than many of the apartments I lived in New York, right? I mean, they're solid quality apartments that they provide to poor people. They funded healthcare and education. So really, they used that oil wealth to benefit the population. However, the U.S., they always faced, Chavez and his successor Maduro, they always faced a fundamental problem. The economy has always been heavily reliant on oil, and it did not have many other industries. They tried to diversify, but it's very difficult to convince people, for instance, to go out and live in the countryside to grow food, because Venezuela historically imported the majority of its food. So as recently as 2019, when the U.S. launched this coup with Juan Guaido and all of that, Venezuela was still importing about half of its food from other countries. So then the U.S. put all these sanctions on Venezuela. It could no longer export its oil, and it could no longer import not only things like food, but also it couldn't import the machine parts and the capital goods it needed to fix the equipment and that it needed to export the oil, right? I mean, obviously, oil doesn't just magically come out of the ground. You have to drill it. And when you're drilling it, you have to use this technology that needs to be kept up, right? If it breaks, you have to repair it. Well, if you can't import that technology because it was all made by U.S. companies, because even though Chavez nationalized the oil industry, it was using technology that over many decades had been built by U.S. companies, right? They didn't have a significant technology sector. So with the sanctions, it became very difficult to keep up all of the oil production. It started declining. Then we talked about earlier the U.S. shale boom, which also collapsed oil prices. There was also the end of the commodity supercycle that hit many countries in Latin America. There was this congruence of many different factors. And then the sanctions just made it, they collapsed Venezuela's oil sector. And if you go to the U.S. Energy Information Administration website, the EIA, they boasted about this in the Trump administration. They posted a graph, and they say something like, this was in 2019, and it says, oil production in Venezuela has fallen to its lowest levels in modern history. And they're basically boasting that was because of the sanctions. And you can see I have a graph that I often show in my reports. It shows that every time the U.S. imposed sanctions, oil production declined. So people say, it's socialism, blah, blah, blah. People who say that know nothing about Venezuela. And again, this is not a problem of socialism. This is a problem that many oil exporting countries have faced. And can you imagine what would happen to Saudi Arabia's economy if the U.S. put sanctions on Saudi Arabia and said that it cannot export oil? It would probably face an even worse economic crisis.
Yeah. And at this point, I don't think it's possible because Saudi Arabia is sort of drifting away from that anyway. And like you said before, China's a great customer for them. But
yeah, one other quick note. Quick note on this. Venezuela was kind of like the canary in the coal mine. So, this de-dollarization initiative, it's not new. In fact, this goes back decades, but famously in Iraq, Saddam Hussein actually was selling his oil in euro. And this was in the 2000s, the euro was still new and people thought that the euro could challenge the dollar. And obviously that didn't happen. But de-dollarization has been a project for many years.